the horrific reality of breeding farms during the era of slavery. Envision a nation founded on liberty, yet marred by the bondage of countless individuals traversing the somber depths of America's history, where the echoes of enslaved Africans resonate through the cotton fields. In the early 17th century, the initial African slaves were introduced to North America, signifying the commencement of a somber epoch in the nation's history. The transatlantic slave trade, which originated in the late 15th century, resulted in the forcible transportation of approximately 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic between 1525 and 1866, with around 10.7 million enduring the harrowing journey. This human cargo, uprooted from their homes and families, would serve as the foundation of the American economy for generations. The narrative of slavery encompasses the transatlantic slave trade, coerced labor, the egregious treatment of individuals, and the eventual cessation of the slave trade. However, a lesser-known consequence of the early 19th century abolition was the emergence of a more nefarious facet of slavery: sex farms and slave breeding farms. The objective of these establishments was straightforward: to generate additional slaves. Slave owners, unable to import individuals from Africa, resorted to breeding them akin to livestock. They meticulously selected which slaves would procreate based on physical characteristics, health, and even intelligence, with the aim of producing the most robust and economically advantageous offspring. Slave breeding farms were prevalent across the southern United States, with estimates indicating that up to 70 were operational at the peak of their prominence. These farms were typically managed by affluent plantation owners who regarded slave breeding as a profitable enterprise. However, the atrocities associated with these farms extended beyond mere economic exploitation. In certain instances, plantation proprietors established intimate farms where enslaved individuals, often young girls, were coerced into intimate activities with other slaves or the plantation owners themselves. The progeny resulting from these coerced encounters were regarded as lucrative commodities and frequently auctioned to the highest bidder. The precise magnitude of these practices is challenging to ascertain, as records were often obliterated or intentionally concealed. However, it is estimated that thousands of enslaved individuals were compelled to partake in these breeding programs, leading to innumerable atrocities and violations of human rights. In this video, we will disclose the most egregious facts regarding slave breeding and dark farms in the United States. These revelations may be distressing, but it is crucial to confront the brutality and inhumanity of slavery in all its manifestations. Let us explore the harrowing history of breeding farms and the unyielding toil of cotton plantations, observing the narratives of both the oppressed and the defiant. This is a past we cannot afford to overlook. The mechanism that magnified misery. The cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney. As the 18th century concluded, a young Yale alumnus named Eli Whitney arrived in Georgia in pursuit of opportunities. Unbeknownst to him, his invention, conceived in the expansive cotton fields, would transform the American economy and impose a profound, ominous impact on the institution of slavery. Prior to Whitney's arrival, cotton processing was exceedingly laborious. The separation of the adhesive seeds from the cotton fibers was a protracted and arduous endeavor predominantly executed by enslaved individuals. This rendered the cultivation of short-staple cotton, which flourished in the South, unprofitable. Planters concentrated on long-staple cotton, which thrived solely in restricted coastal regions and was simpler to process. Nevertheless, in 1793, Whitney introduced his revolutionary innovation, the cotton gin. This straightforward yet innovative equipment could process cotton at an extraordinary rate, 50 times quicker than a human worker. Suddenly, short-staple cotton became exceedingly lucrative, irrevocably altering the southern landscape. Plantations driven by the prospect of affluence proliferated swiftly. Inland short-staple cotton became vital to the southern economy, but at a significant human cost. Strangely, the machinery intended to diminish labor requirements ultimately heightened the demand for enslaved individuals. the demand for labor to cultivate and process the expanding cotton crops intensified, leading to a spike in the importation of enslaved Africans, so further entrenching the institution of slavery in the South. Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved individual who emerged as a formidable advocate for abolition, acknowledged the poignant irony of Whitney's innovation. He noted that the white man's capacity to subjugate the black man stemmed from the nation's advancement. The cotton gin, designed as a symbol of progress, became into an instrument of oppression, exacerbating the suffering of millions. Sowing shadows, the grim exploitation of slave breeding in America. Concealed amid the grim, the narrative of American slavery encompasses a particularly harrowing chapter, the practice of slave breeding. This was not merely a matter of profit margins, it constituted a deliberate and systematic intrusion into the most intimate aspects of enslaved individuals' lives, a cruel manipulation of their bodies and families for the economic gain of slaveholders. As the importation of enslaved Africans diminished in the late 1700s and was ultimately prohibited in 1808, the demand for labor in the expanding cotton fields of the South did not wane. Instead, it took a sinister turn inward. Slaveholders, aiming to sustain their workforce and augment their wealth, began to concentrate on breeding enslaved individuals, coercing them to reproduce in order to generate a new generation of enslaved laborers. Virginia, characterized by its substantial enslaved population, earned the designation of the breeding state. Locations such as Lumpkin's Jail in Richmond, infamously known as the Devil's Hofacre, emerged as focal points for this abhorrent activity. One of the most unsettling realities regarding these dark farms under slavery is that enslaved women were regarded as mere reproductive instruments. Plantation proprietors and overseers regarded them as a method for generating additional enslaved individuals to augment their riches and influence. To attain this objective, enslaved women were frequently compelled to engage in relations with multiple males, irrespective of their own wishes or permission. This approach was especially common in the Deep South, where the climate and soil were conducive to cotton growth and the demand for enslaved labor was significant. Enslaved women on these estates frequently endured severe physical and intimate abuse, with no prospect of escape or recourse. They were seen as property rather than as human beings, and their bodies were treated accordingly. Forced breeding was prevalent not only in the Deep South, but also in other sections of the country, such as the Chesapeake Bay Area and the Upper South. Plantation proprietors in these regions regarded enslaved women as a method to augment their wealth and influence, utilizing them appropriately. Historical texts provide proof of the coerced breeding of enslaved women. Plantation documents frequently contain references to enslaved women designated as breeders or breeding stock. These documents also disclose the number of offspring born by these women, along with their age, health, and other pertinent information. In addition to plantation records, there exist several slave memoirs that chronicle the experiences of enslaved women compelled to reproduce. One such account is that of Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman residing in North Carolina around the mid-19th century. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs recounts the trauma of being coerced into sexual relations with her lord to bear children. Female slaves were coerced into relationships with their owners or overseers. The exploitation of female slaves was pervasive. Throughout the era of American slavery, enslaved women endured not just coerced labor, but also sexual exploitation by their proprietors and overseers. This technique was not confined to any specific location or plantation, rather, it was widespread across the American South. The initial evidence of exploitation of female slaves can be linked to the transatlantic slave trade. Female slaves were frequently captured and compelled to undertake the lengthy and grueling voyage across the Atlantic, characterized by confined and unclean conditions. Female slaves endured exploitation by crew members and other male slaves. In the American South, female slaves endured heightened exploitation. This abuse manifested in several forms, including rape and coercion. Proprietors and supervisors of intimate connections and prostitution frequently exploited their power and authority to compel enslaved women into intimate liaisons. These interactions were frequently characterized by violence and a lack of consent, leading to the impregnation of numerous enslaved women. The offspring resulting from these coerced interactions were regarded not as the progeny of their fathers, but as the property of their mother's masters. Consequently, these children were likewise enslaved and could be sold or traded like any other commodity. This method was especially prevalent in the Upper-Lower South, where slaves were cultivated for sale to the South. An illustration of this practice is the narrative of Sally Hemings, a slave owned by former U.S. President Thomas Jefferson. Hemings was coerced into a relationship with Jefferson, resulting in the birth of 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. These children were not acknowledged as Jefferson's offspring during his lifetime. However, DNA evidence has subsequently validated their paternity. A notably troubling instance of intimate assault is the case of Celia, an enslaved woman owned by Robert Newsom. In Missouri, Newsom regularly assaulted Celia, resulting in her pregnancy. He declined to recognize the child as his progeny. Celia was prosecuted and convicted of murder and subsequently hung after killing Newsom in self-defense. This instance underscores the harsh realities of abuse and violence endured by several enslaved women in the American South. The progeny generated on sex farms were estranged from their family and sold immediately after weaning. The separation of families during slavery was pervasive, with enslaved children frequently sold away from their parents. This practice was especially pronounced on the farms. Enslaved women compelled to reproduce were frequently impregnated by males who were neither their husbands nor partners. The children generated on these filthy farms were not integrated into a nuclear family unit, but were instead commodities intended for sale for profit. Historical records indicate that numerous plantation owners regarded the sale of enslaved children as a profitable enterprise. The price of an enslaved child fluctuated based on criteria like as age, gender, and health, although they were often sold for a higher price than adult enslaved individuals. This was due to the children's ability to mature into productive, laborious, and future progenitors. Enslaved children were frequently sold at public auctions, resulting in their separation from their mothers and other family members. These auctions were frequently distressing for both the enslaved individuals being sold and those left behind. In his book, The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, historian Edward E. Baptist elucidates the mental anguish endured by families throughout their separation. Enslaved individuals lamented and cried out, many rushing to the periphery of the auction platform, extending their arms towards children, parents, or partners being sold away from them. The division of families on these dark farms had enduring repercussions for the enslaved individuals affected. Children sold from their mothers frequently endured a lifetime of misery and loss, while parents compelled to relinquish their offspring bore the enduring anguish of that separation throughout their lives. Certain plantation proprietors would provide incentives to enslaved males who could father the highest number of offspring. It may be inconceivable that an individual could be compensated for impregnating numerous women. However, this was a reality for certain chained males on the farms. During the era of slavery, plantation proprietors would provide incentives to enslaved men capable of producing the most number of offspring, which would subsequently be sold for profit. This approach sustained the dehumanization of enslaved individuals and reinforced their classification as property rather than as sentient beings with agency and individuality. In certain instances, plantation proprietors would go as far as to incite enslaved men to compete in impregnating the greatest number of women. This not only inflicted pain on the enslaved women coerced into this system, but also fostered a toxic atmosphere among enslaved men compelled to vie for the praise of their enslavers. An illustration of this is seen in the diaries of James Hammond, a plantation owner in South Carolina during the mid-1800s, when he chronicled his endeavors to breed enslaved individuals for profit and expressed pride in the fertility of his enslaved women. He stated that he provided incentives to enslaved men who could impregnate the most women, stating that it served as a significant motivator for them. This behavior is not only morally abhorrent, but also resulted in enduring repercussions for the enslaved individuals compelled to engage in the system. The progeny generated through this method were frequently sold immediately after weaning, resulting in familial isolation and exacerbating the dehumanization of enslaved individuals. Enslaved women classified as proficient breeders frequently received superior treatment compared to their counterparts. Following the prohibition of the slave trade, enslavers resorted to women to increase their slave population. During this period, women were perceived as reproductive instruments, and their capacity for childbirth was a crucial determinant of their worth. Enslaved women regarded as efficient breeders were highly esteemed, and plantation owners frequently afforded them superior treatment compared to others. Historian Deidre Cooper Owens asserts that plantation owners employed numerous criteria to assess which women were suitable for breeding. Factors such as age, physical characteristics, and fertility rates of enslaved women who fit these criteria were compelled to engage in intimate relations with male slaves, frequently against their consent, and were thereafter monitored closely during their pregnancies to guarantee the production of healthy progeny. Plantation proprietors frequently afforded superior living circumstances and sustenance to enslaved women deemed effective breeders. They would also provide them with preferential treatment regarding work assignments and disciplinary actions. The offspring generated by these women were deemed more valuable and profitable for the plantation owner. An illustration of this is evident in the life of renowned abolitionist Harriet Jacobs. Jacobs was enslaved in North Carolina and compelled to bear 2 children with her owner, Dr. James Norcom. She was regarded as a valuable breeder and had comparatively favorable treatment relative to other enslaved women on the plantation. Nonetheless, Jacobs declined to bear any additional children with Norcom and opted to conceal herself in a confined attic room for 7 years to evade his overtures, notwithstanding the preferential treatment. Despite receiving certain privileges, enslaved women remained subjected to the harsh realities of slavery. They continued to be regarded as property and were compelled to engage in non-consensual intimate acts. Slave breeding constituted a lucrative enterprise for slave owners and was perceived as a means to augment their wealth. The reproduction of enslaved individuals enabled plantation proprietors to augment their riches by generating more enslaved individuals without incurring further labor costs. Frequently maintained meticulous records of the offspring born on their farms, documenting their age, sex, and lineage. These records functioned as a mechanism for proprietors to monitor their assets and assess the value of their property. Offspring of enslaved mothers were frequently auctioned, with their value influenced by several criteria including as age, health, and gender. The profitability of enslaved people's breeding is shown in records like as those of Thomas Thistlewood, the Jamaican plantation owner, who maintained detailed documentation of his breeding procedures that would be uncovered centuries later. From 1750 until 1786, he documented almost 3,000 births on his farm. A significant number of them resulted from coerced breeding. Thistlewood regarded the reproduction of enslaved individuals as a means to augment wealth, observing in his diary that all slaves are lucrative, but breeding women yields greater profit than men. An additional illustration of the profitability of slave breeding is shown in the narrative of Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, 2 slave merchants that conducted operations in Alexandria, Virginia. Franklin and Armfield specialized in the slave trade, amassing wealth through the purchase and sale of enslaved individuals. They also participated in slave breeding, with Franklin estimated to have fathered over 600 children with female slaves in his possession. These offspring were subsequently sold or traded for profit. Numerous historical documents substantiate these egregious practices, including advertisements for slave auctions that emphasized the breeding potential of enslaved women, often referring to them as prolific breeders or good breeders. These advertisements starkly illustrate the inhumane and exploitative essence of the slave trade. Plantation owners employed physicians to supervise the breeding of enslaved individuals and address any medical concerns that emerged. Although it may appear contradictory for physicians, who are traditionally healers, to oversee the breeding of enslaved people, this was a prevalent practice on numerous plantations during the antebellum period. Plantation proprietors employed physicians to ascertain the health of enslaved women for breeding purposes and to address any medical concerns that emerged during the breeding process. A particularly infamous instance of this is Dr. J. M. Marion Sims, frequently designated as the progenitor of contemporary gynecology. Sims conducted several experimental surgeries on enslaved women in the mid-1800s, including procedures to rectify fistulas, a disorder frequently arising during childbirth. Sims performed these surgeries without anesthesia, as he held the belief that enslaved individuals did not perceive pain similarly to white individuals. His research on fistulas resulted in the advancement of novel operations. However, it exacted a significant toll on the enslaved women who were subjected to his experiments. In addition to conducting surgeries, physicians were tasked with ensuring that enslaved women maintained sufficient health to bear children. This frequently entailed overseeing their nutrition and addressing any ailments that might impede their fertility. However, it is crucial to emphasize that this care was not rendered out of compassion for the enslaved individuals, but rather to guarantee their capacity to generate additional enslaved individuals for the financial gain of the plantation owner. Enslaved women and sexual exploitation farms frequently received insufficient nutrition and health care, resulting in elevated newborn death rates, while fertile women were seen as valuable assets, utilized as reproductive instruments to generate further slaves on the farms. The living circumstances on these farms were equally poor, resulting in the survival of many infants being compromised. Enslaved women on the dark farms were compelled to labor extensive hours in the fields, resulting in their inability to adequately care for their infants. The newborns frequently suffered from malnutrition and illness, while the women lacked access to adequate medical treatment, contributing to elevated infant mortality rates. Robert Lumpkin, the jail operator, not only profited from the sale of enslaved individuals, but was also involved in the coerced breeding of enslaved women. The personal narratives of enslaved individuals provide insight into the profound consequences of this practice. In her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Woman, Harriet Jacobs chronicled the persistent sexual harassment and abuse inflicted upon her by her enslaver, Dr. James Norcom. Norcom's activities were motivated not solely by lust, but by a strategic intent to generate additional enslaved offspring, coercing Harriet into a compelled reproductive role against her consent. The writings of Mary Chestnut, a Southern planter's wife, offered her another viewpoint. She observed the troubling occurrence of mixed-race children on estates, fathered by white slaveholders yet born into slavery. Chestnut's prose resembled that of ancient patriarchs. Our males reside in a single household with their wives and concubines, and the mulatto offspring observed in each family closely resembles the white youngsters. Her statements reveal the concealed truth of slave reproduction and the duplicity of a system that seemed to champion family values while concurrently dismantling enslaved families. When white gold dominated the territory, the supremacy of King Cotton. In the 19th century, a fundamental crop was cotton ascended to rule the American South, converting the region into a worldwide economic powerhouse and entrenching its reliance on the harsh institution of slavery. This narrative recounts the dominion of King Cotton over the territory, interlacing an intricate fabric of affluence and anguish. The ascendance of King Cotton originated not in the South, but in the thriving textile mills of England, driven by the relentless demands of the Industrial Revolution. Southern planters, perceiving an opportunity, enthusiastically adopted cotton production. The ports of Charleston, Mobile, and New Orleans emerged as centers of activity as substantial volumes of cotton were transported across the Atlantic. Historian John Motley articulated the worldwide influence of this southern crop, declaring, "Cotton is king, and he wields his scepter not only over these 33 states, but also over the island of Great Britain across continental Europe." By the 1830s, cotton constituted about 2/3 of all U.S. exports, establishing it as the nation's most valuable commodity. Unfortunately, the wealth produced by King Cotton was irrevocably tied to the atrocities of slavery. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, a fervent proponent of slavery, proclaimed in Congress, "Without resorting to violence, they wage war against us, we could subjugate the entire world." What would occur if cotton were not supplied for 3 years? Hammond's statements, albeit hubristic, underscored the South's conviction that its dominance in cotton production conferred substantial economic and political might. This power originated from the coerced labor of millions of enslaved individuals, and as cotton plantations proliferated, the demand for enslaved labor surged. By 1860, roughly 4 million enslaved individuals labored in the southern cotton fields, their existence and toil serving to enrich a small elite of plantation proprietors. The pervasive influence of King Cotton extended well beyond the South, benefiting bankers in New York, shipowners in New England, and textile mill operators in England, thereby establishing a complex network of economic interdependence that rendered the challenge to slavery a formidable endeavor. Cotton fever permeated the South, resulting in the emergence of towns such as Cottonwood, Cottondale, and Cotton Plant throughout the region. A historical account recounts a Southern planter who, when confronted regarding the South's dependence on cotton, extracted a cotton seed from his pocket and proclaimed, "Sir, within this seed resides more power than in all the crowns of Europe." This narrative encapsulates the confidence and ambition that defined the King Cotton era. What aspect of life and labor on cotton farms astonished you the most? Beneath the pall of white gold. Existences endured beneath the cotton. The expansive cotton fields of the antebellum South presented a landscape of stark contrasts, where the luminous promise of white gold overshadowed the lives of enslaved individuals. Their days were characterized by arduous labor, yet interspersed with moments of resilience, community, and the enduring aspiration for freedom. Envision awakening before dawn, with the southern sun already emitting its extreme heat upon plantations such as Montello and others in Mississippi's Naz District. Enslaved individuals were stirred from their slumber by the overseer's summons. This indicated the commencement of another arduous day in the cotton fields, their agile fingers plucking and filling apparently endless sacks with cotton flowers. Nevertheless, cotton was not the sole requirement for their time and expertise. Enslaved artisans at James Madison's Montpelier estate included proficient blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons responsible for constructing and upkeeping the plantation infrastructure. Enslaved women, alongside agricultural labor, engaged in cooking, cleaning, sewing, and frequently attended to the offspring of their enslavers, leading lives characterized by perpetual toil and subjugation. Harriet Jacobs, a former enslaved individual, eloquently articulated the profound impact that incessant labor had on her spirit. As spring arrived and nature regained her beauty, the human spirit sometimes experiences rejuvenation. Nevertheless, for Jacobs and many others, these instances of optimism were ephemeral, eclipsed by the grim realities of their servitude. In spite of relentless tyranny, enslaved individuals discovered methods to create realms of humanity and defiance. They recounted narratives from their African origins, conveyed tales of optimism, and discovered instances of laughter and connection. Spirituals imbued with encoded messages of escape and liberation permeated the atmosphere with songs like As Steal Away to Jesus and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, providing solace and a sense of collective purpose. Evenings provided a fleeting reprieve from labor. Enslaved families congregated in their confined cabins, sharing scant meals and deriving solace from one another's presence. On certain plantations, Saturday evenings were characterized by dances and festivities, resonating with the rhythms of Africa throughout the night. Sundays, although designated as a day of repose, frequently involved attending to personal gardens, an essential source of sustenance to augment their insufficient provisions. Resonances of home, indomitable spirits in constrained eras. In the core of the 18th century South, despite extensive cotton plantations and the grim realities of slavery, a dynamic and resilient culture emerged. Enslaved Africans, although deprived of their liberty in their native land, retained within them the remnants of their history, interlacing a vibrant tapestry of customs, narratives, and melodies that resisted the degrading impacts of slavery. As the sun descended over the South Carolina plantations, the rhythmic percussion of drums reverberated through the atmosphere, transmitting not merely melodies but encoded messages of defiance. These clandestine communication networks, established under the vigilant supervision of overseers, enabled enslaved individuals to disseminate information, provide assistance, and sustain the aspiration for liberation. In their African homelands, storytellers, referred to as griots, played a crucial role in safeguarding the cultural memories of their communities. Venture Smith, an enslaved individual who chronicled his life from Africa to America in 1798, emerged as a compelling advocate, recounting his experiences and motivating others to preserve their history, including the Blandinians, Dectarant, Tricono, Cut-Res, and distinctive rituals. The Gullah community residing on the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina created a unique Creole language, blending English and African languages. Their culture, a dynamic amalgamation of African traditions and New World influences, thrived despite the terrible circumstances they encountered. Their music, dances, and culinary creations such as okra stew reflected their adaptation and resolve to maintain their individuality. The family constituted a cornerstone of enslaved existence amidst enforced separations and the perpetual risk of being sold away from loved ones. Enslaved individuals established their own kinship networks, providing support and a sense of belonging. Terms such as auntie and uncle transcended biological connections, denoting respect and affection within the enslaved community. Holy dichotomies. The celestial interplay of oppressor and downtrodden. In the antebellum South, religion assumed a multifaceted and frequently contradictory role in the lives of both slaveholders and enslaved individuals. For the powerful, it functioned as a justification for slavery, whereas for the oppressed, it emerged as a source of solace, resistance, and a conduit to freedom in the grand churches of Charleston and Savannah. Slaveholders sought justification for their acts in selectively chosen biblical passages, such as Ephesians 6 verse 5, which instructed slaves to obey their owners. The Bible was employed to support the belief that slavery was divinely sanctioned and that enslaved individuals were required to acquiesce to their enslavers. It served as an instrument to uphold the status quo and suppress dissent. However, abolitionists such as John Brown and William Lloyd Garrison contested this interpretation by utilizing the same scriptures to promote the abolition of slavery. Garrison, recognized for his impassioned discourse, frequently used Galatians 3 verse 28. There is no distinction between Jew and Greek, slave and free, or male and female, all are unified in Christ. Jesus contended that the authentic message of Christianity emphasized equality and that slavery constituted a distortion of divine will. While the elite engaged in theological discourse, enslaved individuals forged their own distinctive religious experiences. Within the concealed areas of the estates, they amalgamated African customs with Christian beliefs, creating a vibrant and soulful spirituality that offered solace and resilience amidst profound adversity. The forests encircling the plantations transformed into clandestine sanctuaries, where individuals congregated under the moonlight to worship, sing, and seek comfort in their collective faith. Denmark, an enslaved man in Charleston, utilized his biblical knowledge to motivate and orchestrate a planned insurrection in 1822. He established comparisons between the suffering of oppressed individuals in America and the Israelites in Egypt, portraying himself as a contemporary Moses guiding his people towards liberation. The spirituals performed in the fields transcended mere work songs. They served as encoded messages of hope, resistance, and a yearning for emancipation. Descend Gently. Sweet Chariot, featuring its evocative melody and lyrics referencing the biblical narrative of Elijah's ascension to heaven, emerged as a symbol of hope for enslaved individuals yearning for liberation. Water, especially in the context of baptism, possessed profound symbolic significance for enslaved individuals, conducted in clandestine ceremonies by riverbanks. Baptism symbolized not only spiritual rebirth, but also a purification from the trauma and degradation of slavery. The spirituals wade in the water, which instructs escaping slaves to wade through rivers to evade tracking dogs, exemplifies the fusion of religious and pragmatic guidance in these coded songs. Shadow Journeys, the silent torrent of America's inner slave trails. The atrocities of human trafficking did not vanish when the transatlantic slave trade was officially prohibited in 1808, they merely changed course. This internal trade, which is frequently disregarded in historical narratives, was a silent torrent of suffering that tore families apart. It transported enslaved people from the Upper South to the burgeoning cotton plantations of the Deep South. A vast and brutal domestic slave trade arose. Cities such as Richmond and New Orleans became centers for the internal trade of slave enclosures, leaving an indelible mark on the American landscape. The urban landscape was dotted with grim holding cells for those awaiting sale. Auction blocks, which were frequently situated in prominent public spaces, served as stages for the dehumanizing spectacle of human beings being bought and sold like livestock. The air was permeated with the odor of dread, despair, and the muffled cries of families that were being violently separated. This trade, which was conducted from Alexandria, was the source of the wealth of renowned slave traders such as Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. They organized the forced migration of thousands of enslaved individuals to the Deep South in Virginia. Enslaved individuals were frequently subjected to forced feedings and iron masks to prevent them from communicating or attempting to escape during their journey, as their business was meticulously organized. This domestic slave trade resulted in the agony of innumerable individuals. The haunting symbol of this era was the journeys of Corfu chains, which bonded enslaved and saved individuals together in long lines. These caravans of captive souls traversed the American landscape, enduring hardship and cruelty along the way, whether by foot, wagon, or steamboat. The forks of the road in Naz, Mississippi, a notorious market, became infamous for its human suffering, as lives were purchased and sold with callous indifference. The memoir, 12 Years a Slave, by Solomon Northup, a free black man who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, offers a first-hand account of this internal trade. His chilling words, "I was soon to learn what I was worth," spoken as he awaited his own sale, encapsulated the dehumanizing experience of being reduced to a commodity. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of safe houses and secret routes that operated in parallel to the slave trade, offered a beacon of hope to those seeking freedom. Ironically, the very infrastructure that facilitated this forced migration, the rivers, roads, and railways, also provided avenues for escape. Harriet Tubman, a former slave, endangered her life on numerous occasions to assist others in achieving freedom along these routes, thereby embodying the spirit of resistance and the unwavering pursuit of liberty. The enslaved people were able to resist and maintain their hope despite the immeasurable suffering they endured by singing songs of defiance, such as the spiritual Follow. The drinking good, which is suspected to have contained coded instructions for evading slavery, was transformed into potent instruments of resistance. These musical expressions provided solace, encouragement, and a path to freedom. Even Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, became a major center for the domestic slave trade. Slave pens operated in the shadow of the Capitol building, a conspicuous reminder of the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty while simultaneously profiting from the enslavement of millions. The economic impact of this internal slave trafficking was immense. The institution of slavery was further embedded in the nation's financial system as banks issued loans based on the value of enslaved people as collateral, and insurance companies offered policies on their lives. Silk and Iron: the intertwined narratives of enslaved women on cotton farms. The existence of enslaved women on cotton plantations was a multifaceted interplay of fragility and resilience. They were mothers, workers, caregivers, and artisans. Their days characterized by arduous labor, profound sorrow, and instances of tranquility. The defiance exhibited in their narratives, frequently marginalized or ignored, underscores the extraordinary courage and perseverance of individuals who faced the harsh reality of slavery. As dawn illuminated the cotton fields, enslaved women collaborated with their male colleagues in the arduous endeavor of cotton picking. Their labor-worn hands deftly navigated the thorny vegetation, accumulating the white gold that sustained the Southern economy, but their efforts did not conclude there. Following the day's harvest, they returned to the plantation house, where they prepared meals, performed cleaning tasks, engaged in sewing, and attended to the children of their enslavers. Their existence constituted an unending cycle of labor, with their physical and emotional well-being exploited to sustain the opulent lifestyles of the slaveholding aristocracy. Harriet Jacobs, in her poignant autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Woman, offered a stark insight into the sexual exploitation endured by numerous enslaved women. She described the perpetual menace of harassment and abuse from their enslavers, a threat that loomed over their existence like a dark cloud. Jacobs endured 7 years concealed in a cramped attic to evade her master's advances, exemplifying the extremes to which enslaved women would resort to safeguard their autonomy and dignity. Motherhood, typically a profound source of love and joy, became a bittersweet ordeal for the enslaved. The arrival of a child, though celebrated, was fraught with the harrowing anxiety of potential separation through sale at any moment. Mothers sung lullabies that conveyed both affection and sorrow for their impoverished circumstances. The intricate tapestry of labor interlacing cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Cotton serves as a powerful emblem of slavery in the American South. Tobacco was not the sole crop interwoven into the structure of this harsh system. Sugar and rice each occupied a specific position in the colonial and antebellum economies, influencing the lives of enslaved individuals in unique and frequently harsh manners. In the early 1600s in Jamestown, Virginia, John Rolfe, an English planter, introduced a sweeter variety of tobacco from the Caribbean. This golden weed, as it was termed, rapidly altered Virginia's economy, converting tobacco into a medium of exchange and propelling the colony's expansion. Benjamin Franklin, a polymath, acknowledged the societal grip of tobacco, remarking that a pipe of tobacco would deplete a grow, being 1/3 of his weekly budget, yet cultivating tobacco proved to be a laborious task. In contrast to cotton, it exhausted the soil, necessitating regular changes in cultivation sites. The cultivation process was complex and labor-intensive, requiring meticulous attention from seedbed to harvest. Although enslaved labor was crucial to tobacco plantations, these operations were typically smaller than the huge cotton estates in the Deep South. Further south in the humid regions of Louisiana, a profitable crop emerged: sugar. The Caribbean was the epicenter of the sugar trade. However, Louisiana became a notable producer in the 18th century. Sugar production was an incessant, continuous operation requiring rapidity and efficacy. The adage "sugar must not wait" highlights the imperative of swiftly processing cane to prevent juice spoilage. The boiling houses, where enslaved individuals labored under extreme heat to convert cane juice into sugar crystals, were infamously perilous and unhealthy, rendering sugar plantations among the most lethal environments for enslaved people. A phrase frequently misattributed to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister of King Louis XVI, underscores the European fixation on sugar. Sugar does not cultivate along the banks of the S. This assertion, despite its erroneous attribution, exposes Europe's unquenchable craving for sugar and the indifferent disregard for the human toll of its production in the colonies. Simultaneously, rice agriculture thrived in the low-lying coastal regions of the Carolinas and Georgia. Rice planting was a laborious and intricate endeavor necessitating the establishment of sophisticated irrigation systems and arduous work by enslaved Africans from West Africa's rice-growing areas, such as the Gambia, who contributed essential knowledge in rice production. This expertise, however forcibly obtained, occasionally provided them with a measure of autonomy in their everyday activities, distinguishing rice fields from those centered on sugar or tobacco. In the antebellum South, cotton was not merely an agricultural product, but also a symbol of affluence, authority, and a lifestyle intricately linked to the system of slavery. As the United States became as the preeminent cotton producer globally, the South's reliance on enslaved labor fostered a profound divide between the North and South, a divide that would ultimately culminate in the Civil War. By the 1850s, cotton constituted an astonishing 60% of U.S. exports, serving as the cornerstone of the Southern economy. Enslaved individuals, whose existence and toil were devoted to the cultivation of this lucrative commodity, constituted the bedrock of this affluence. The South, characterized by its extensive cotton plantations and a dominant elite. Firmly committed to preserving slavery, the South regarded its supremacy in the cotton industry as a pillar of economic and political power. Conversely, the North, experiencing swift industrialization and increasingly swayed by abolitionist ideals, perceived slavery with escalating moral indignation and economic apprehension. Harriet Beecher Stowe's impactful novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, released in 1852, revealed the atrocities of slavery to a broad audience, invigorating the abolitionist movement and swaying public sentiment against the South, notwithstanding the escalating hostilities. Southern officials, such as Senator John C. Calhoun, ardently advocated for slavery, asserting it as a beneficial institution for both black and white individuals. They contended that cotton was paramount, and their dominance in worldwide cotton production afforded them the authority to establish their own conditions. A succession of political compromises and conflicts exacerbated the division. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 sought to preserve equilibrium between slave and free states. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which permitted territories to determine the status of slavery via popular sovereignty, resulted in Bleeding Kansas, a violent precursor to the Civil War as pro- and anti-slavery factions engaged in conflict. The deeds of John Brown, a militant abolitionist who believed he was divinely mandated to eradicate slavery, exacerbated tensions. The 1859 attack on Harper's Ferry, despite its failure, illustrated the intensity of abolitionist zeal and the readiness to employ violence to fulfill their objectives. Brown emerged as a contentious figure, regarded as a martyr by some and a lunatic by others. However, his actions highlighted the escalating rift between the North and South. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican opposed to the expansion of slavery, in 1860, served as the ultimate provocation for the South, which feared that Lincoln's administration would jeopardize their way of life. The Southern states seceded from the Union, driving the nation into the Civil War, and even European nations were involved in the drama of America's internal strife. Britain, significantly dependent on Southern cotton for its textile sector, observed the developments with apprehension. Still, public opinion in Britain, which had abolished slavery in its empire in 1833, favored the Union. Lincoln, acknowledging the significance of maintaining British neutrality, dispatched a consignment of cotton to Britain throughout the conflict, indicating that the North could fulfill their requirements and deterring them from endorsing the Confederacy. Resonances of the Fields, commemorating the cotton heritage. The civil rights movement of the 1960s ignited a revitalized emphasis on the legacy of slavery leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. established a direct connection between historical battles and the contemporary pursuit of equality. His impactful "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered in 1963, resonated with the unfulfilled commitments of liberty and justice for all, warning the nation that the history of slavery continued to loom over American culture. This period also necessitated a reassessment of the pedagogy surrounding slavery in educational institutions. Textbooks, which had formerly downplayed or overlooked the severity of slavery, were amended to offer a more precise and thorough narrative. Initiatives such as the 1619 Project, initiated by the New York Times in 2019, sought to recontextualize American history by emphasizing the ramifications of slavery and the achievements of Black Americans as central to the narrative. Museums such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., serve as essential venues for the preservation and dissemination of the narratives of enslaved individuals, providing a profound tribute to their endurance and ingenuity against profound adversity. Art has emerged as a potent instrument for confronting the legacy of slavery. Kara Walker's evocative silhouette installations challenge spectators with the harsh reality of plantation life and stimulate discussions around race, power, and memory. Individuals and families are contending with the ramifications of slavery on a personal level. The unearthing of antiquated diaries, correspondence, and various items in attics and basements has enabled individuals to reveal their relatives' involvement in this somber period of American history, inciting thought, reconciliation, and occasionally, distressing revelations. Nonetheless, the process of recollection is fraught with difficulties. The current discourse around Confederate statues and symbols exemplifies the profound differences that persist in the interpretation and commemoration of history. Some perceive these monuments as commemorations of Southern heritage. Others perceive them as bitter reminders of oppression and racial supremacy. The reverberations of the cotton fields persist in American society, compelling us to confront uncomfortable truths, engage in difficult dialogues, and strive for a more just and equitable future by recognizing the legacy of slavery, honoring the memories of its victims, and committing to dismantling its enduring impacts. We may initiate the healing of historical wounds and construct a society that genuinely embodies its principles of liberty and justice for all. That's it for today. To support our channel, please subscribe.